Hi everyone, welcome back to this Introduction to Phonology at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität München. Today we're going to conduct a sort of transitional lecture between weeks 9 and weeks 10. Our topic for today is phonological variation. This will lead us nicely into discussion of phonological change in week 10, since, as we'll see, variation probably plays a significant role, an important role, in conditioning or leading to phonological change. So, of course, we, to start, probably need some type of definition of what phonological variation is, or at least a working definition that we can begin with. I'll term phonological variation a situation when we find some phonological sequence. We say there's an underlying sound X, and this underlying sound X has more than one possible surface output. So at least two possible different outputs, let's call them A and B, under identical phonological conditions. So this would be a case in which we cannot find any type of environment, any type of phonological factors or morphological factors, for that matter, that seem to explain when we should find variant A and when we should find variant B. So if we find, let's type up this once more explicitly, if we find segment X realized as both A and B, and there is no phonological environment, we can say that both sounds A and B are equally allowed to occur in the same environments, then we're talking about a case of phonological variation. So let's make a simple example, an invented example in this case. So let's say that a language has a word kafi, which means apricot, and when we find speakers in this language saying this word, and they say it in isolation alone, so that we know that there are no influences of boundary effects, as we talked about in the previous set of lectures, we find several different pronunciations of the word initial consonant. It can be pronounced as kafi with a voiceless velar stop, hafi with a voiceless velar fricative, or gathi with a voiced velar fricative. So it looks like the word is realized in three different ways under apparently three identical conditions. More specifically, we might say that this language, it appears that this language has some sound. We, for the moment, can't determine what the underlying representation of this sound is. Well, I've given it for our example. Let's assume that it's an underlying ka, and that we have some means of determining that it's an underlying ka. And this underlying ka can be realized as a voiceless velar stop, a voiced velar fricative, or a voiced velar stop, all in the same environment of at the beginning of a word before the vowel a. That is, all three of these different sounds are allowed to occur in identical conditions. So this word, kafi, has those three allomorphs, and if we draw an allomorphy diagram, then we have the underlying form kafi to start with, and its three allomorphs will be, as we've said, kafi, hafi, and gathi. Let's copy this data for the voiced interdental fricative. So this word has this monomorphemic word of our invented language has these three allomorphs. And as I just drew here, the sound ka, assuming that we're dealing with an underlying ka, it has at least three allophones that are in free variation with one another, ka, cha, and ga. The question is, how then we can try to account for this variation and what sort of further information we might want to have. So if you look more into the topic of phonological variation generally, it turns out that there are probably lots of extra linguistic factors that may influence the occurrence of variant sounds, in particular social factors, we're going to kind of, for today, abstract largely from those social factors and try to talk about things in more abstract theoretical terms. And we're going to assume in all of this that speakers have a capacity for learning not just the so-called categorical phonological rules of their language that say under a given condition, a given process will always apply, but also variable processes which allow for a process to sometimes apply and sometimes not apply. And ultimately, behind this question is the problem of how we should formalize variation and why phonological variation exists at all. Those are somewhat deeper questions, which we may touch on briefly, but I will largely leave to more advanced courses. So today we're going to look at two major kinds of phonological variation. The first will be instances of variation that arise from the application of so-called variable or optional rules, and this case leads to so-called token variation. So by token, in this case, we mean one instance of the pronunciation of the same word. So for instance, when our word in our invented language here, kathi, is pronounced, let's say that the speaker pronounces it 5 times and twice it is pronounced as kathi, twice it is pronounced as kathi with a voice, with a voiceless velar fricative instead of a stop, and once it is pronounced as gathi, then we would say that we have 2 tokens of kathi, 2 tokens of hathi, and 1 token of gathi in our data. And this variation in terms of the pronunciation of the same word constitutes token variation. So let's say that again. Token variation means different possible realizations, different possible pronunciations of the same lexeme. On the other hand, we will see instances of variation arising from the lexical specification of variant usages. That is, instances in which it looks like the lexical items themselves seem to determine whether or not they can undergo some processes. And we've actually seen in previous lectures something that looks like this sort of type variation. For instance, when we talked about F voicing in English, that is alternations in the form of words like wolf versus the corresponding plural form of wolves. So where we have this alternation between F and V, which seems to be determined by the lexeme, and we'll review that again below. And we're going to contrast a categorical approach to variation, which we saw in some previous lectures. For instance, the lecture when we talked about F alternation, and that was in our discussion of productivity. And we'll look at an explicitly quantitative approach here today. So to begin, in your textbook, you should have sometimes encountered cases where Bruce Hayes in your textbook has marked certain rules as being optional. And let's take the rule of tapping in North American English for the moment as being such an optional rule. This is a case in which a coronal stop becomes a coronal tap, preceding a stressless vowel following a glide or another vowel or the English rhotic. So here, optional simply means that the rule could apply or might not apply when the applications for its condition are met. So in the word that has the underlying representation, I'll use careful speech to give the underlying representation. Ladder has an underlying voiced stop. There, the conditions for the application of tapping are met because the underlying duh precedes a stressless vowel and is preceded by another vowel. And if this rule is optional, meaning it is allowed to apply or not to apply, then we can have both ladder with a tap or ladder with a stop. And similarly, the word agility, which would have an underlying voiceless coronal stop, meets the structural description for this rule. The underlying ta occurs between two vowels, neither of which are stressed. So both agility with a tap and agility with a stop are possible forms. And let's represent using a sort of branching derivation, which is shown sometimes in your textbook, what this looks like. So if we have the input agility, then through tapping, there are two possible paths that the output can follow. Either tapping doesn't apply or tapping does apply. If tapping does happen to apply, then agility is generated. If tapping doesn't apply, then in the surface form of these words, then the surface form where tapping doesn't happen to apply is identical to the underlying form, and the stop remains a stop. If tapping has applied, then we generate a surface form with that stop. So far, so good. And interestingly, I think you'll find that native speakers of English who have this rule probably have different intuitions about how good or not it sounds to apply tapping in different lexical items. So for instance, my personal intuition is that to pronounce the word ladder without the tap sounds fairly strange. So for me to pronounce it with the stop as ladder takes some effort, whereas the comparatively, I think, less frequent, perhaps, word agility can be pronounced either with the tap or with the stop. Both seem like reasonable options for us. So there's maybe some distinction in behavior as to whether a rule applies or not that goes beyond just what optional rules do. So the optional rule doesn't simply mean that for all words where tapping, where this structural description for tapping is met, that 50% of the time, half of the time, tapping will apply, and 50% of the time, tapping will not apply. The situation seems to be more complicated than this. So let's consider if we regarded tapping as a straightforwardly optional rule, we might then expect speakers to, we probably would not expect speakers to have different intuitions about different words, as I've just suggested. If the rule itself is purely optional, then we wouldn't have this lexically conditioned effect, which suggests that some words really need to have the tap, words like ladder, whereas other words can have the tap and sound okay without the tap as well, such as agility. So what I think here is that probably the optional rule formal device that you have already seen in the readings is probably too coarse. It works for saying why words like ladder and agility can have both tapped and non-tapped variants. It's possible to have both the tapped and non-tapped variants occurring because the marking optional on a rule simply means that the rule only applies sometimes. But I think that this marking misses something about it, fails to capture this linguistic intuition that these two words, ladder and agility, have different relationships to the tapping rule, through which tapping seems to be much more likely to apply to ladder and considerably less likely to apply to a word like agility. Okay, so now that we've conducted this little introduction to the notion of phonological variation, we'll then in the next video, talk about the devices used for generating variation of different types, which you have already encountered in your readings.